Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about the debut album from Dynatron, Escape Velocity. This is a request from a close friend of mine, though in a less than timely fashion. He told me to check out this album all the way back in March, and I just had it lying on my computer this whole time until just recently I finally decided to just pick it up and listen to it. So okay, some background. Dynatron is a Danish producer whose name, as usual, I cannot be bothered to pronounce, and his music falls under the genre known as synthwave. Now, I, as some may know, am not particularly experienced in the world of synthwave, and in fact the only other artists I've checked out in this genre was Comtrue's. And if some may recall my recent review of Comtrue's, I was not particularly impressed by that guy. And not just with the new album, just in general. Like, he relied pretty heavily on, like, his 80s throwback aesthetic, and I just found more often than not, listening to his music felt like I was listening to the same track over and over. Plus, I'm not just really much of an 80s guy myself. The aesthetic alone is not going to draw me into an album. I wanted to have a little more going on. Now granted, I haven't listened to Comtrue since making that video, so, you know, it's not really fresh in my mind, but needless to say, purely because of the genre labeling, I was kind of wary going into Dynatron for the first time. I was hoping, if nothing else, there'd be something more interesting for me here, so what'd I get? Well, I am quite happy to say that I enjoyed this much more than any of Comtrue's stuff. Not only do I think the production is a step up, it's a lot spacier and shinier and just pops out at me more. Not to mention more up-tempo on average, but perhaps what is more key is that I don't feel like I'm listening to the same track over and over on this one. There's a fair bit of variety here, enough to keep me interested basically from start to finish. I don't know if it's the greatest thing I've ever heard in my life or anything. As I said, I'm not typically much of an 80s guy, but this album didn't really give me much of anything negative to say about it either. Just a solid effort overall, I would have to say. So, some track highlights. The opener, Space Operators, was probably my favorite. Just the kind of track that hooks you in immediately and lets you know exactly what you're getting into. And also probably has the catchiest melody played on these bell noises. I also really liked Propulsion Overdrive. I loved its use of the electric guitar sounds. Granted, that track does kinda sorta come off to me as like the soundtrack to an ESPN highlight reel or something like that, but it doesn't stick out so much as to feel out of place or throw off the album's atmosphere. It's just a lot of fun. The other big highlight for me was Andromeda Bleeding, which was purely an ambient track done in the style of Jean-Michel Jarre's Oxygen. Just really some beautiful stuff there. There was also a cool stretch in the middle of the album that had like 3 tracks all flowing perfectly into one another in like a sort of mini-suite, I guess. You had Aurora Nights, Vox Magnetismi, and the Pulsating Nebula. Now, I will have to just come out and say the Pulsating Nebula was probably my least favorite track on the album because it was the least unique sounding on here. It didn't really have that much on it that really popped out at me instrumentally or in the context of the album. Though I did quite like the spooky intro of that track, and also some subtle creepy ambience that occasionally popped in underneath. But the other two in that mini-suite, or whatever you want to call it, were solid. Aurora Nights was probably the most straightforward Comtrue sounding track on the album, but it was also easily the longest and most well fleshed out. Maybe not the catchiest or most memorable track on here, but it was a lot of fun whenever I heard it. Also, just as a side note, Dynatron did something cool with this album in that he made like an album cover for like every individual track aside from the opener, and the Aurora Nights one had the best cover in my opinion, but whatever. Well, either that or Pulse Power, but never mind. Anyway, Vox Magnetismi, which bridges the gap between the two surrounding tracks. I mean, it's a slower track, but it has some great build-up and tension to it. I mean, it's the shortest, but it definitely leaves an impact. And there are some less strong tracks on here, like Fireburner and Pulse Power. I mean, they're really fun, they're up-tempo, but they don't really stick out much besides that. Though, between the two, I undoubtedly prefer the latter, as it's catchier. And there's also Wormhole, which I wouldn't actually call one of the weaker tracks. In fact, it was another one of the standouts for me, given how it came off significantly darker and more foreboding than the rest of the album. Really stuck out to me that way. But I do kind of take issue with it, though, in that it doesn't really feel like a fitting closer to this album. I'm not sure why we're finishing off with the darkest and most foreboding track on here. Like, is Dynatron trying to make like a cliffhanger ending to this album, symbolizing like a spaceship falling into the wormhole, and we don't know where they're going to end up next, to be continued in the next episode. I mean, that's not really the kind of thing that necessarily translates well into an instrumental album, but I don't know. It's a good track nonetheless. I just probably would have placed it somewhere in the middle. Or maybe I just put it at track 8. But yeah, that's basically everything I have to say on the topic of this album, though. It's not exactly the most complex thing I've ever listened to, as can be seen by the fairly short length of this video, but I will say I can definitely see myself coming back to this one in the future. I'm glad I picked it up. I recommend it to any synthwave fans out there. There's up-tempo stuff, there's down-tempo stuff, there's a pretty cohesive space theme that I think the music holds up pretty well. Just overall a solid project, and it's worth checking out. I'm overall feeling a solid 8 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.